away and Micah Bell is somewhere in the dark. But Arthur Morgan doesn't run. He crawls, slowly, painfully, to the edge of a cliff. His body is failing him. His lungs are shredded from months of tuberculosis. His hands are cut and bleeding from the fight, and yet he pulls himself up just enough to look west. And he watches the sun rise. No dramatic speech, no last stand, just a dying man alone on a mountain watching the light come up over a world that never had much use for him. If you've played Red Dead Redemption 2, you know this moment. And if you're anything like the millions of people who did, it absolutely wrecked you. But here's the thing, that sunrise hits different when you understand everything that came before it. Every loss, every choice, every small moment of grace in a life that was, from the beginning, defined by hardship. So today, we're going back to the beginning. We're telling the full story of Arthur Morgan, not the outlaw, not the enforcer, but the man underneath, the scared kid who had nothing, the loyal soldier who gave everything, and the dying man who, in his final hours, finally figured out who he was. This is the tragic life of Arthur Morgan. Arthur Morgan was born around 1863, somewhere in the northern United States. We don't know the exact town. We don't know much about his early years at all, and that's sort of the point. He wasn't the kind of kid anyone was keeping records on. His mother died when he was young. The game never tells us exactly how, just gone. One of those losses that happens in the background of a child's life, like a door quietly closing in another room. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal, not some legendary outlaw with a code and a cause, just a man who stole things and got caught. When Arthur was 11 years old, his father was arrested for larceny, and at some point after that, Arthur watched him die. Think about that for a second. 11 years old, no mother, a father who was more of a cautionary tale than a parent, and then nothing, just the streets. We're told that Arthur was found at 14, living rough, described as a wild delinquent. No home, no future, just a teenager the world had already given up on. And yet, even then, Arthur kept something of his father with him. He took his hat, he kept a photograph, because even when someone doesn't deserve your love, sometimes you love them anyway. That's one of the first things the game teaches us about Arthur, that his loyalty runs deeper than logic, that he holds on even when he probably shouldn't. It's a quality that will define him for the rest of his life, and ultimately, it will destroy him. In 1877, a 14-year-old Arthur Morgan crossed paths with two men who would change everything. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews were outlaws, but to a half-starved, parentless kid with nowhere to go, they were something else entirely. They were a lifeline. Dutch was charismatic in a way that's hard to explain unless you've met someone like him in real life. He had ideas, big, burning ideas about freedom and civilization and the rot at the heart of the American system. He could make you believe that the whole world was corrupt, that the law was a lie, and that the only honest way to live was outside of it. He could make you feel, for the first time in your life, like you mattered. And Hosea was the warmth to Dutch's fire. Clever, funny, deeply human. The kind of man who could talk his way out of anything and laugh about it after. If Dutch was the vision, Hosea was the heart. Together, they took Arthur in, not as a servant, not as muscle, as a son. They taught him to read, to write, to hunt and ride and shoot. They gave him skills, yes, but more than that, they gave him a sense of self. They gave him a place to belong. Arthur went from a feral kid surviving day to day to someone with a family, a purpose, and a future. He became their first protege, one of the founding members of the van der Linde gang. And here's where the tragedy starts to quietly take root, because Arthur didn't just join a gang, he handed Dutch his unconditional loyalty. His whole identity became built around this man, this philosophy, this family. Arthur had nothing before Dutch, which means Dutch became everything. That kind of devotion is beautiful. It's also a vulnerability. Dutch would eventually exploit it, maybe not intentionally at first, but he would. And Arthur, loyal to his core, would keep giving, even as Dutch kept taking. Keep believing, even as the evidence mounted that the man he called a father was falling apart. But that's later. In those early days, it was real. The campfire was warm, the gang was family, and Arthur Morgan, the orphaned street kid, the wild delinquent, finally had a home.
At some point in his young adult life, Arthur met a woman named Mary Gillis, and he fell in love. Genuinely, completely in love, in the way that men like Arthur rarely let themselves fall, because they've learned too early that things don't last. They got engaged. Think about that. Arthur Morgan, Dutch's enforcer, the man that Pinkertons would put a $5,000 bounty on, was ready to build a life with someone. He befriended her younger brother, Jamie. He was kind to her family. For a window of time, Arthur Morgan had a shot at something normal. But the life he'd chosen, or rather the life that had chosen him, made it impossible. Arthur's preference for the gang, for the road, for the only family he'd ever really known, slowly poisoned it. Mary's family disapproved. The world between them grew wider. And eventually, somewhere between 1894 and 1899, they parted ways. He never stopped loving her. Every time she appears in the game, asking for his help, reaching out with letters, you can see it in him. This quiet ache, this road not taken. But as devastating as losing Mary was, it wasn't the deepest wound. That belonged to a woman named Eliza and a boy named Isaac. Around the same time, Arthur had a brief relationship with a young waitress named Eliza, and she became pregnant. Arthur, to his credit, didn't run. He wasn't going to promise her a normal life. He was honest enough not to make promises he couldn't keep. But he showed up. Every few months, he'd ride out and spend time with him. He watched his son grow. He remembered Isaac as a good kid. One day, he arrived at their home and found 2 crosses in the yard. Eliza and Isaac had been killed by robbers for $10. $10. Arthur stood there in silence at those crosses, and something in him hardened permanently. He never really processed that grief. He just buried it, the way men from that era buried everything, deep down, out of sight, where it could quietly poison the soil. He learned something in that moment, though, a lesson that was as simple as it was devastating. If you live this life, don't expect good things. You don't get to have a son and be an outlaw. You don't get to love someone and keep them safe. The world doesn't work that way. And so Arthur Morgan put his head down, went back to the gang, and became exactly what Dutch needed him to be. The enforcer, the fixer, the man who got the job done. He stopped expecting anything for himself. That might be the most heartbreaking thing about him.
Here's something the game does quietly, almost without you noticing. It makes you fall in love with the gang before it tears them apart. Because for all the tragedy woven into Arthur's story, there were good days, real ones. The Vanderlinde gang at its peak wasn't just a band of criminals, it was a community. 50-odd people living outside the rules of a society that had already failed most of them. Former slaves, orphans, runaways, people the 1890s had no use for. And Dutch had pulled them all together under one roof, or one campfire more accurately, and told them they were something. Arthur was at the center of all of it. By the late 1880s, he and John Marston had grown up together, close as brothers. Dutch's 2 favorite sons. There was Hosea, always with a scheme and a story. Lenny Summers, young and sharp and full of fire. Charles Smith, quiet and capable and honest in a way most people in the gang weren't. Javier, Sean, Sadie, Tilly, each of them a world unto themselves, and Arthur knew them all. He robbed trains with them, hustled marks with Hosea, got into legendary bar fights, like the time in Valentine where he got thrown through a saloon window by a man named Tommy, widely considered the toughest guy in town, and then got back up and beat him half to death in the mud, because that was Arthur. He didn't stay down. There's a story, Small but perfect from 1884, Arthur was sent fishing and came back with 3 beautiful bass. The gang threw a feast in his honor, toasted him all night. The following week, Dutch and Arthur were walking through the market and someone recognized the fish. Arthur had bought them from a fishmonger and passed them off as his own catch. He was absolutely mortified. That's the Arthur nobody talks about enough. The one who was a little bit ridiculous sometimes, who had a dry wit and a tendency to grumble, who would write surprisingly thoughtful journal entries about the landscapes he passed through and sketch portraits of people he met, because somewhere under all the violence there was a man who noticed beauty. He had a dog named Copper he was deeply fond of, a horse named Boadicea he loved. He was a surrogate uncle to little Jack Marskin, gentle and patient with the boy in a way that was startling if you only knew Arthur the Enforcer. These were the golden days, and they felt at the time like they could last. They couldn't. They never do. But Arthur Morgan lived them fully, and they were real. And later, when everything was falling apart, it was those days he was quietly grieving. Not just the life he never had, but the life he actually did have and was losing.
It all starts to break at Blackwater. By the spring of 1899, the gang was camped just outside the town, a place undergoing that particular American transformation from frontier to industry. Dutch had a plan. He always had a plan. This one involved robbing a ferry laden with riches coming into town. Big score, big risk. Hosea didn't like it. Arthur had doubts, but Dutch was convincing, the way he always was. And Micah Bell, the gang's newest and most dangerous recruit, was whispering in Dutch's ear, pushing the plan forward. Micah, we'll get back to him. The heist went catastrophically wrong. The Pinkertons ambushed them mid-robbery, leading to what would become known as the Blackwater Massacre. Multiple gang members killed, others seriously wounded. Dutch, Arthur, and the survivors barely escaped with their lives, fleeing north into the mountains in a winter storm with law enforcement on every side. Arthur suspected from the start that something wasn't right, that they'd been set up. He was correct, but it would take the entire game for him to learn the full truth of how. What Blackwater represents more than anything is the end of a chapter. The gang had survived hard times before, but they'd always bounced back, moved on, found a new camp, run a new con, laughed about it over a campfire. This felt different. The Pinkertons weren't letting go, the pressure wouldn't lift, and the decisions Dutch started making from this point forward began to take on a desperate, erratic quality that the old Dutch, the one Arthur grew up believing in, would never have made. The gang that stumbles out of the mountains at the start of Red Dead Redemption 2 is already dying. They just don't know it yet. Arthur knows something is wrong, he just can't admit it, not to himself, not fully, because admitting it means admitting that Dutch might not be the man he always believed him to be, and Arthur's entire identity is built on that belief. So he keeps going, keeps riding, keeps doing what Dutch needs him to do. He always does.
By this point in the story, Arthur is tired. Not physically, though that too, but somewhere deeper. The kind of tired that comes from doing things you can't quite justify anymore. He's been collecting debts for Leopold Strauss, riding out to desperate, destitute people, farmers, widows, sick men who clearly don't have what they owe, and squeezing them anyway, because Dutch needs the money, because the gang needs to run, because Arthur does what needs doing, same as always. He doesn't let himself think too hard about it. He's watching Dutch make decisions that feel wrong and telling himself there's a plan. He's watching Micah orbit closer and closer to Dutch's ear and pushing the unease down somewhere he doesn't have to look at it. And then comes the cough. There's a man early in the game named Thomas Downs, a rancher, a kind man, visibly sick, who genuinely doesn't have the money he owes Leopold Strauss. Arthur collects the debt anyway, because that's the job, and Arthur does the job. He grabs Downs by the collar, beats him, and leaves. He doesn't think much of it at the time. Months later, in Saint Denis, Arthur is walking through the city when a violent coughing fit doubles him over. He collapses. A stranger helps him to a clinic,
and a doctor named Joseph Barnes looks him over and delivers the verdict with the quiet, almost apologetic tone of someone who has said this before and knows there's nothing to soften the blow. Tuberculosis. Contracted, almost certainly, from Thomas Downs, the sick man Arthur roughed up for pocket change. In 1899, tuberculosis is a death sentence. Slow, grinding, humiliating. It eats your lungs. It takes your strength. It turns a powerful man into a husk over the course of months until he's coughing up blood and struggling to breathe. What happens next is, in my opinion, one of the most quietly remarkable things any game has ever done with a character. Arthur doesn't spiral. He doesn't rage. He doesn't fall apart, at least not entirely. Instead, something shifts in him, like a man who's been squinting into the sun his whole life and finally puts on glasses. He starts to see things more clearly. He tells Mary Beth that the world looks better, almost, since the diagnosis. Sharper, more vivid. He opens up to Rain's Fall, a Wapiti Indian chief, about things he's never told anyone. The death of Isaac, the grief he never processed, the guilt he's carried for years. He kicks Leopold Strauss out of the camp, unable to stomach the human cost of the debt collecting he's been doing for years. He starts asking, quietly but persistently, what any of this was actually for. The tuberculosis doesn't break Arthur Morgan. It wakes him up, and it sets the stage for the final act of his life, where he has to decide, in the time he has left, what kind of man he wants to be remembered as.
And when he looks up from that question and really looks at Dutch, maybe for the first time in 20 years, he doesn't like what he sees. Because Dutch is changing, or maybe revealing himself. The man who once handed stolen money to orphanages is now killing people in cold blood. He drowns Angelo Bronte in a swamp and throws his body to alligators in front of the gang, without remorse. He manipulates Eagle Flies, a young Wapiti warrior full of fire and idealism, into a war with the U.S. Army and lets that young man die for it. Every time Arthur raises a concern, Dutch has a speech ready, a justification, a vision of the horizon that keeps moving further away. And always, always, Micah Bell at his shoulder. Micah joined the gang late. Dutch liked him. Arthur never did. There was something rotten about Micah, something performative about his violence, something deliberately poisonous about the way he wedged himself between Dutch and the people who had known him longest. What none of them knew, what Arthur only discovers near the very end, is that Micah had been feeding information to the Pinkertons the whole time, since Guarma. Every ambush, every disaster, every time the law seemed to know exactly where they'd be, Micah. The Blackwater Massacre, the Saint Denis Bank, all of it. And Dutch knew, or suspected, and chose Micah anyway. That's the part that finally breaks Arthur. Not just the betrayal, but the fact that Dutch, faced with the truth, looked the other way. Because Micah told Dutch what he wanted to hear, and Arthur, honest, blunt, dying, reminded Dutch of everything he didn't want to face. Arthur loved Dutch like a father. Dutch used Arthur like a tool. In his final weeks, sick and exhausted, watching everything he built his life on collapse in real time, Arthur Morgan has to make peace with that, has to figure out what loyalty means when the thing you were loyal to turns out to be a lie. He doesn't stop loving Dutch. That's the most heartbreaking part. He just stops following him.
And in the end, Arthur Morgan didn't become a legend because he was the toughest gun in the West. Plenty of men were tough. Plenty could shoot. What made Arthur different was that he changed. When he realized the life he'd been living was built on lies, he didn't double down on it. He tried to make things right. He helped John escape. He helped strangers who would never even know his name. And when the end finally came, he faced it looking at the sunrise. Arthur Morgan started his life as an outlaw, but somewhere along the way, he became something a lot rarer, a good man.